The wind was a scythe across the barren plains, whipping Alara's threadbare shawl around her shoulders like a taunt. It carried the scent of dust and the memory of smoke, an acrid phantom that clung to her even now, months later. Each gust felt personal, a cruel hand pushing against her back, urging her towards an uncertain future. She huddled deeper into the meager protection of a rock formation, the biting cold seeping into her bones despite the late afternoon sun. The wagon, a rickety thing salvaged from what remained, stood listing a few yards away, its single surviving wheel sunk slightly into the alkali earth. It held little beyond a few scorched pots, a faded blanket, and the ghosts of everything she had lost. Her fingers, chapped and raw, traced the outline of a small, charred wooden bird tucked into the pocket of her dress. It was the only thing she had pulled from the ashes that held any trace of life, a small, silent testament to a life that was no more. She hadn't spoken a full sentence in weeks, perhaps longer. The words felt like pebbles in her throat, heavy and sharp. What was there to say? Everything that mattered had been consumed by the fire: her home, her family, her laughter. Especially her laughter. She remembered its sound sometimes, a faint echo from a distant world, and the memory was a fresh wound. People in the few settlements she'd passed through saw the emptiness in her eyes, the soot stains that seemed permanently etched into her skin, and they looked away. Or worse, they looked with pity mixed with suspicion. A lone woman, scarred and silent, traveling alone in this harsh land. It was unnatural. It was unsettling. They offered grudging scraps of food, never shelter, never kindness that went beyond a hurried transaction. She was a pariah, marked by tragedy, a walking reminder of how quickly life could be reduced to embers. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal hues of orange and purple, mocking the desolation below. Alara knew she couldn't stay here. The rock offered little defense against the predators, two-legged or four, that roamed these parts after dark. She needed to move to find shelter, water, basic needs that felt monumental in her depleted state. Every muscle ached, not just from the physical toll of walking for days, but from the constant tension that held her body rigid. She was a wound that wouldn't close, constantly exposed to the elements, to the world's indifference. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a dull, persistent ache that had become a familiar companion. She had a few dried beans, hard as stones, but chewing them felt like too much effort. She watched a hawk circle high above, its cry a lonely sound in the vast silence. Seemed so effortless, so free. Unlike her, grounded by grief, weighed down by memories. She pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the last sliver of sun was about to disappear. There was nothing there but endless, unforgiving land. No sign of life, no hint of reprieve. Despair was a cold, creeping fog, threatening to engulf her entirely. She had walked this far on sheer instinct, a primal urge to survive, but the strength was waning. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of the flames, the heat, the sound that still roared in her ears sometimes when it was quiet. The silence of the plains was broken only by the wind, and even that seemed to whisper accusations. Why her? Why had she been spared? The survivor's guilt was a heavy cloak, smothering any flicker of hope. She sank further down against the cold rock, the dust settling on her face like a shroud. The world felt vast and empty, and she felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The darkness began to creep in from the edges of the sky, bringing with it the chill of the coming night and the amplified sounds of the wilderness, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of unseen things in the dry brush. Each sound was a threat, each shadow a potential danger. She opened her eyes, scanning the fading landscape with a vigilance born of necessity, not courage. Courage felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. A faint light appeared on the horizon, barely discernible against the twilight. It was a wavering speck, too steady for a star, too low for the moon. Alara watched it, her heart giving a tiny, unwelcome jolt. People. Could it be? She hadn't seen a dwelling in 2 days. Hope was a dangerous thing, she knew. It had been extinguished so completely before. But the light persisted, growing slightly brighter as the sky darkened. It meant humans. It meant potential danger, yes, but it also meant the possibility of warmth, of water, of a moment's respite from the endless, brutal journey. Her muscles screamed in protest, but a flicker of determination ignited within her. She had to reach it. She pushed herself up from the ground, her limbs stiff and aching. The small wooden bird felt cold in her pocket. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she turned her face towards the distant light and began to walk, one hesitant step after another, swallowed by the encroaching night. The wind continued its relentless assault, but she no longer felt its push. She felt only the pull of that distant, fragile light. It was a beacon in the overwhelming darkness, a faint promise in a world that had shown her only cruelty. She focused all her remaining energy on it, letting it guide her through the rough terrain. Every step was a small victory against exhaustion and despair. She stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. The light seemed no closer, but she knew she was moving towards it. It was all she had left. The thought of collapsing here, alone in the dark, was unbearable. She had to keep going. For whom, she didn't know. For herself, perhaps. The self that was still clinging to existence by a thread. Hours seemed to pass, marked only by the increasing ache in her legs and the growing clarity of the light. It was a lantern swaying gently, and behind it, the dark shape of a small structure. Not a settlement, just a lone building. A homestead? Out here? It seemed impossibly isolated. As she drew closer, the details began to emerge in the faint light spilling from a single window. A small, sturdy house made of rough-hewn logs, a corral nearby, the faint outline of a barn. It was modest, remote, but it was unequivocally human. Her approach was slow, cautious. Every instinct screamed danger, but the need was greater. She stopped a short distance from the house, hesitant to step out of the protective darkness. Should she call out? Knock? Her voice felt rusty, unusable. She stood there for a long moment, a silent figure in the night, watching the window, gathering the last vestiges of her courage. The light seemed warm, inviting, a stark contrast to the cold darkness surrounding her. But what kind of people would live so far out here? What would they want from a stranger? The possibilities, both good and bad, swirled in her exhausted mind. She gripped the wooden bird in her pocket, its smooth, cool surface a small comfort. It reminded her of a time when such places represented safety, warmth, community. Now they represented uncertainty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened, casting a rectangle of warm yellow light onto the porch. A figure stood silhouetted against the light, tall and broad-shouldered. They paused, scanning the darkness. Alara held her breath, frozen. The figure didn't call out, didn't seem immediately aggressive. They simply stood there, still. It wasn't the boisterous, suspicious greeting she might have expected in a saloon or a town. It was quiet observation. After a long pause, the figure stepped out onto the porch and then, slowly, down the steps. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs. He was a man. She could tell by his gait, his size. He moved with a quiet confidence, not the wary tension she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men's stances. He stopped about halfway between the house and where she stood, barely visible in the gloom. He still didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and apprehension. It was an unnerving encounter, yet there was something in his stillness that didn't feel immediately threatening. Felt patient, waiting. Finally, in a voice that was low and steady, he spoke. Lost. His voice was deep, without judgment or surprise. Just a simple question stated plainly. Alara swallowed, the action painful. The pebble-like feeling in her throat intensified. She tried to speak, to force a word out, but only a dry, rasping sound escaped. She cleared her throat and tried again. Yes, she managed. The single word brittle and thin against the vastness of the night. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He didn't move closer, didn't demand explanations. He simply stood there, a solid presence in the darkness. "Come on then," he said, turning back towards the house. "Can't stay out here." He didn't look back to see if she followed. He seemed to assume she would. It wasn't an invitation, exactly, more of a simple statement of fact, delivered without inflection. It was a strange kind of welcome, devoid of the usual formalities or suspicions. It was just offered, needed. Alara hesitated for another moment, her instincts warring with her desperate need. But the quiet acceptance in his voice, the lack of fear or aggression, was disarming. She began to walk again, her steps tentative at first, then gaining a little confidence as she moved towards the light and the waiting figure. She reached the porch steps, and he stood aside, letting her pass. She paused at the threshold, the warmth of the house hitting her like a physical force. It smelled of wood smoke, something cooking, and earth. It was a simple, honest smell. He followed her in, closing the door quietly behind them, shutting out the wind and the darkness. The room was small but tidy, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled cheerily. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center, a cot along one wall. Simple, functional. He gestured towards one of the chairs at the table. "Sit," again, a simple instruction, not a command. She obeyed, sinking onto the wooden seat, her legs trembling. She looked up at him for the first time in the light. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. His face was weathered, lines etched around his quiet eyes, but clean-shaven. His hair was dark, pushed back from a high forehead. He had large, capable hands, calloused and strong-looking. He didn't smile. His expression was serious, watchful, but not unkind. He went to the fireplace and stirred a pot hanging over the flames. The aroma intensified, stew, thick and savory. Her stomach clenched painfully. He didn't ask her name, didn't pry. He just went about the simple task of preparing food, his movements efficient and silent. She watched him, still unable to fully comprehend her presence here. It felt unreal, a sudden, jarring shift from the relentless hardship of the plains. He ladled a generous portion of the stew into a bowl and placed it in front of her, along with a hunk of dark bread. "Eat," he said. It wasn't an offer, it was an expectation. She looked down at the food, then back at him. His eyes met hers briefly, and in them, she saw a flicker of something that might have been understanding, or perhaps just weariness. She picked up the spoon, her hand shaking slightly. The first bite was difficult to swallow, her throat tight with disuse and emotion. But the warmth, the flavor, the nourishment was profound. She ate slowly at first, then with more urgency as her hunger overcame her reluctance. He sat opposite her at the table but didn't eat. He simply watched her, his gaze steady but not intrusive. He didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence with chatter. He let her eat in peace, a silent guardian. It was the most peaceful moment she had experienced in months. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, but inside, there was a quiet calm. When she finished, having scraped the bowl clean, she felt a little of her strength return. She looked up, meeting his gaze properly this time. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling less like pebbles now. He nodded, a slight dip of his head. "Needed it." He took the bowl and washed it in a basin by the hearth. Then he brought her a cup of water. She drank greedily. The simple acts of sustenance felt like miracles. He didn't ask about her past, didn't question why she was alone, didn't demand payment or explanation. He simply saw a person in need and provided. It was a quiet, unassuming form of charity, devoid of the pity she had come to dread. It was just what was needed. She looked around the small cabin again. It was sparsely furnished, but clean. A rifle hung on the wall. A few books were stacked on a small shelf. It was the home of a man who lived deliberately, who valued practicality and solitude. She still didn't know his name. She hesitated, then asked, her voice stronger now, though still quiet. What is your name?" He turned from the basin, drying his hands on a rough cloth. "Silas." Silas. The name felt solid, like the man himself. "Alara," she offered in return. He nodded again, acknowledging the exchange of names without making a fuss about it. Elara, he repeated, the sound of her name on his lips feeling strangely real after so long hearing only the wind or her own thoughts. He then gestured to the cot along the wall. You can sleep there tonight. Be safe inside. It was an offer of shelter, simple and direct. She felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought tears to her eyes. To sleep under a roof, by a fire, without the constant threat of the elements or unseen dangers. Thank you, she said again, her voice thick with emotion this time. He didn't respond with words, only that quiet nod. He fetched a folded blanket from a trunk and placed it on the cot. Then, without another word, he blew out the lantern, leaving only the firelight to illuminate the room. He lay down on the floor near the hearth, wrapping himself in his own blanket. It was an unspoken boundary, a quiet act of protection. He didn't intrude on her space, but he remained close, a watchful presence. Elara lay down on the cot, the blanket rough but warm against her skin. The simple mattress felt luxurious after sleeping on hard ground. She watched Silas's silhouette by the firelight. He lay still, seemingly asleep, yet she felt his quiet vigilance. The sounds of the night were muted by the walls, the wind merely a murmur now. For the first time in a long time she felt a fragile sense of safety. The raw, exposed wound felt less vulnerable, perhaps beginning the slow, arduous process of healing. Sleep came reluctantly at first, her body still tense, her mind replaying fragments of the past. But eventually exhaustion won. She drifted into a troubled sleep, the image of flames still flickering behind her eyelids, but overlaid now with the steady glow of Silas's fire and the quiet reassurance of his presence in the room. It was a fragile beginning, a single thread of warmth in a cold, desolate world. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Silas was by the hearth, cooking breakfast. He looked up as she stirred, his expression unchanged, quiet, serious. "Morning," he said, his voice low. It was the most elaborate greeting he had offered yet. She sat up, feeling stiff but rested in a way she hadn't felt in months. The nightmares had been less vivid, less insistent under this roof. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still quiet, but a little less rough. He finished cooking, set a plate of bacon and biscuits before her at the table, and poured her a mug of coffee. He then served himself and sat down opposite her again, eating in silence. He ate quickly, efficiently, his movements economical. Elara ate more slowly, savoring the taste of real food. The silence wasn't awkward or strained. It was simply present, companionable in its own quiet way. After they finished, Silas cleared the dishes. He didn't ask her plans, didn't suggest she leave. He simply went outside. Elara watched him through the window. He walked towards the corral, where 2 horses stood tethered. He moved with a quiet strength, at ease in the open space. He seemed like a part of the landscape, rugged and self-sufficient. She wondered how long he had lived here, alone. What kind of life was this, so isolated? Yet, there was a sense of peace about the place, a quiet resilience that mirrored something she desperately sought within herself. She spent the morning tending to the small fire, tidying the cabin quietly. She felt compelled to contribute, to show her gratitude in some small way, even though he hadn't asked anything of her. Silas returned later, carrying an armful of chopped wood. He placed it by the hearth and then turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You skilled at anything?" The question was blunt, practical. It wasn't an assessment of her worth, but rather an inquiry into capabilities. It felt less like an interrogation and more like an honest attempt to understand. Elara paused, thinking. What skills did she have left? She had run a household, managed finances, tended a garden. But those skills felt distant, tied to a life that was gone. She looked at her hands, still stained with soot, roughened by her journey. I can cook, and tend to things. A garden? Animals, perhaps. Silas nodded slowly. Got chickens. Small vegetable patch when the rain comes. Cows in the summer range, he paused, considering. Could use the help. If you're looking for a place, the offer hung in the air. Place. Not just shelter for a night, but a place. A possibility of putting down roots, however temporary, in this barren land. A chance to stop walking, to stop running. It was unexpected, generous in its quiet simplicity. But it also meant staying, facing the stillness, facing herself without the constant distraction of movement. Could she do that? Could she bear the quiet? She looked into his steady eyes, searching for any hint of motive beyond simple need. There was none. Just a quiet proposition, born of practicality in a world that demanded it. I could, she said, the words catching in her throat slightly. If you are sure, he nodded again. Sure enough. Pays for itself, work does. He wasn't offering charity, but an exchange. Work for sustenance, safety, a place to be. Felt less like a handout and more like a lifeline. And so Alara stayed. The first few days were a blur of quiet adjustment. She fell into a routine dictated by the sun and the needs of the small homestead. She learned to collect eggs from the temperamental hens, to milk the scrawny cow that Silas kept for milk and butter, to tend the nascent vegetable patch, coaxing life from the dry soil. Silas was a man of few words, but he was a patient teacher. He showed her how to mend a fence, how to handle the horses, how to read the signs of the weather in the sky. He didn't hover or micromanage. He simply demonstrated, then trusted her to learn. Their interactions were minimal, centered around the tasks of the day. Meals were eaten in silence. The only sounds the clink of cutlery and the crackle of the fire. Yet, in the quiet shared work, a different kind of communication began to emerge. A shared rhythm, a mutual understanding. They worked side by side in the field, each focused on their task, yet aware of the other's presence. It was a silent partnership, built on necessity and a quiet respect for each other's capabilities. Alara found a strange solace in the physical labor. It tired her body, quieted the restless turmoil in her mind. The earth felt solid beneath her feet, the rhythm of the task's grounding. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and loss that had defined her recent past. Here there was order, predictability. The sun rose, the work needed doing, the sun set. Simple, enduring truths. She still didn't speak much, her voice reserved for necessary communication. Silas didn't press her to talk. He seemed content with the quiet. He spent his days ranging the land, checking fences, hunting for food, his long hours mirroring her own labor on the homestead. They were two solitary figures, bound together by the harsh demands of this remote life. Slowly, subtly, the tension in Alara's shoulders began to ease. The constant vigilance, the expectation of the next blow, began to recede. Under Silas's quiet protection, she started to feel safe. Not completely, not yet, but enough to breathe a little easier. She noticed the small things, the way he always left a fresh bucket of water by the door, the way he made sure the fire was stoked before he went out, the way his gaze, though serious, held no judgment. He saw her not as a victim, not as a burden, but simply as Alara, a person capable of work, a partner in the difficult task of surviving here. One evening, as she was washing the dishes, she noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on the windowsill. It was similar to the one she carried, but larger, more detailed. She looked at it, surprised. It hadn't been there before. She looked at Silas, who was mending a saddle near the fire. He didn't meet her gaze, didn't acknowledge the bird. He had simply left it there, a silent offering. It was a small, unexpected act of kindness, and it touched something deep within her, a place she thought had been irrevocably hardened. The days blurred into weeks. The vegetable patch began to show hesitant signs of life, small green shoots pushing through the dry soil. The hens laid their eggs dutifully. Alara learned to bake bread that was heavy but nourishing, to make stew from whatever Silas brought back from his hunts. She still carried the charred wooden bird in her pocket, but she also found herself looking at the one on the windowsill, a different kind of symbol. One of quiet creation, not loss. She hadn't asked Silas about it, and he hadn't explained. Simply was. They continued their silent partnership, the rhythm of their days predictable and grounding. The vastness of the land outside the cabin walls still felt overwhelming at times, but inside, there was a small, contained world they were building together, piece by quiet piece. One afternoon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Silas, who was always scanning the distance, spotted it first. His expression turned grim. "Riders," he stated, his voice tight. They watched the cloud approach. As the figures became clearer, Silas's jaw tightened. "Know them," he said, his voice low. "Trouble, there were 3 of them riding hard. They weren't travelers passing through. They were headed directly for the homestead." Elara felt a return of the familiar tension, the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She glanced at Silas. His face was set, his eyes narrowed. He didn't show panic, but a quiet readiness. "Inside," he instructed, gesturing towards the cabin. He went to the wall and took down the rifle. Elara hurried inside, her heart pounding. She stood by the window, watching as Silas walked out to meet the riders, the rifle held loosely at his side. They pulled up short of the cabin, 3 rough-looking men on dusty horses. Their leader, a man with a scarred face and a cruel grin, seemed to know Silas. "Silas," he called out, his voice loud and mocking. "Didn't expect to find you still scratching dirt out here." Silas didn't respond, his gaze steady. "Come to collect on that debt, Silas?" The man continued, dismounting slowly. "Said you'd have it by now. My patience is wearing thin." Elara pressed closer to the window, listening, her fear mingling with a growing concern for Silas. He had a debt? To men like this? Silas finally spoke, his voice calm. "Said I'd pay when I could. Had a hard year." The scarred man laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "A hard year? We all have hard years. That's the price of doing business, ain't it? Or maybe you ain't much of a businessman." Silas, his companions chuckled. The tension crackled in the air. Silas remained still, the rifle a quiet threat, or perhaps just a deterrent. "The money ain't here," Silas stated. "Workin' on it. Give me more time." The scarred man spat in the dirt. "Time's up. Thought maybe you'd found something out here." Struck a vein. "But looks like it's just you and the dust." His eyes flickered towards the cabin, and Elara instinctively shrank back from the window. "And who's inside, Silas? Hidin' something valuable?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Silas's body tensed almost imperceptibly. "Nobody," he said flatly. "Just me." The scarred man didn't look convinced. "Don't lie to me, Silas. Heard tell you took someone in. A woman. Alone, is she?" His grin widened. "Maybe she's worth something. We could settle your debt that way." Elara felt a wave of nausea. He was suggesting. She looked at Silas, his back to her, his body rigid. He was alone out there against 3 armed men. "She's nothing to you?" Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "Leave now." The scarred man took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol in his holster. "Or what, Silas? You gonna shoot all 3 of us?" "Don't be foolish." He gestured to one of his men. "Go check the cabin. See what he's hidin'." Elara's breath hitched. She couldn't let them in. She couldn't go back to being helpless, hunted. She looked around the cabin desperately. There was no weapon here, nothing to defend herself with. But then her eyes fell on the small wooden bird on the windowsill. And next to it, the kindling axe Silas used for splitting wood. It was heavy, sharp. It was something. A spark of defiance, cold and hard, ignited within her. As the man started to walk towards the cabin, Elara grabbed the axe. It was heavy in her hands, but the weight felt strangely empowering. She stood by the door, hidden from view, listening to the exchange outside. The scarred man was still taunting Silas, distracting him. The footsteps of the approaching man grew louder. She took a deep breath, bracing herself. The door handle turned. The man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small room, a look of anticipation on his face. It shifted to surprise as he saw her standing there, axe raised. Before he could react, before he could speak, Elara swung the axe with all her might. She didn't aim to kill, only to defend, to repel. The flat of the blade connected with his shoulder with a solid thud. He cried out, staggering back out the door onto the porch. Silas, hearing the cry, spun around just as the man stumbled out, clutching his shoulder. The scarred man and his remaining companions stared, momentarily stunned. Elara stood in the doorway, the axe still in her hands, her chest heaving. She was trembling, but she hadn't fled. She had stood her ground. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, focusing on Elara, then back on Silas. The playful malice was gone, replaced by cold fury. "You hidin' that wildcat in there, Silas?" he snarled. "Think you can fight us off with her?" Silas didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle slightly, aiming it steadily at the scarred man. "Get out," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Now, before this goes bad for all of you." The other two men looked uncertain. Silas's quiet resolve, the unexpected ferocity of the woman they thought was helpless, had shifted the dynamic. The scarred man hesitated, weighing his options. Silas was alone, but he had the drop on them, and Elara was clearly not the easy target they'd expected. The element of surprise was gone. With a final, venomous glare at Silas and Elara, the scarred man remounted his horse. "This ain't over, Silas," he yelled. "You hear me? You owe me." Silas didn't respond. He held the rifle steady until the three men turned their horses and rode away, disappearing back into the dust cloud from which they came. Elara watched them go, the axe still heavy in her hand, her body shaking uncontrollably now that the immediate threat had passed. She lowered the axe slowly, leaning against the doorframe for support. Silas walked slowly back to the cabin, his eyes scanning the retreating figures until they were out of sight. He lowered the rifle, the tension draining from his posture. He looked at Elara, standing there with the axe, her face pale but resolute. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, very slowly, a small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines, revealing a warmth she hadn't known was there. "Didn't think you had that in you," he said, his voice quiet, a hint of surprise and admiration in it. Elara managed a shaky breath. "Didn't know I did either." He stepped closer, his gaze still on her face. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "Could have hid," she shook her head. Couldn't let them hurt him. Couldn't let them take her. Couldn't be the helpless victim anymore. The words weren't spoken, but they hung in the air between them. Silas nodded, understanding. He reached out and gently took the axe from her trembling hands. His fingers brushed hers, a brief electric contact. He placed the axe back by the kindling pile. He didn't ask about the debt, didn't explain who those men were. It wasn't the time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fierce reds and oranges again. But this time, it didn't feel like a mockery. It felt like a testament to the day's end, to having survived. Silas walked over to the fire, stirring the coals. Elara remained by the door, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The fear was still there, a cold residue, but it was tempered by something new, a sense of fierce pride, of capability. She had fought back. She hadn't collapsed into despair or helplessness. She had acted. Silas turned back to her. The small smile was gone, but the warmth lingered in his eyes. "You need to rest," he said, his voice gentle. "It's been a long day." She nodded, feeling the exhaustion finally catching up to her. She watched him as he prepared their simple dinner. The silence between them was different now. It was still quiet, but it was filled with the weight of shared experience, of a bond forged in the face of danger. They had faced a threat together, protected each other in their own ways. The trust that had been slowly building was cemented in that moment. After dinner, as the fire settled into glowing embers, Elara found herself looking at the wooden bird on the windowsill again. It represented resilience, quiet endurance. It represented Silas's quiet strength, and her own newly discovered. She sat on the cot, watching the firelight dance on the walls. Silas sat by the hearth, cleaning his rifle, his movements practiced and steady. The rhythmic click and slide of the metal was a comforting sound. The memory of the fire still haunted her, a constant ache in her heart. But the memory of the axe in her hand, the surge of defiance, offered a counterpoint. She was not just the woman who lost everything. She was the woman who fought back, the woman who could stand her ground. She looked at Silas, his profile etched against the firelight. He had given her shelter, sustenance, and something more profound, a quiet space to heal, and the unexpected opportunity to rediscover her own strength. She thought about his smile earlier, fleeting but genuine. It was a crack in his stoic facade, revealing a depth she hadn't fully perceived. He was not just a solitary man enduring a harsh life. He was a man capable of quiet kindness, of subtle generosity, of seeing potential in someone broken. Their shared silence felt less like emptiness and more like a language of its own, one built on observation, respect, and unspoken care. She had come here a wraith, a ghost clinging to the edges of existence. Now she felt a tentative return to being solid, real. The world outside was still dangerous, still uncertain. The men who had come today would likely return. But she faced it differently now. She faced it not alone, but with Silas, in the quiet strength of their shared space. One evening, as dusk was settling, Silas was outside finishing a chore. Alara stood on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of deep indigo. The air was cool and still. She looked at the landscape, so vast and empty. Yet now, marked by their small cabin, it felt less terrifyingly infinite and more like a challenging, formidable home. Silas came up onto the porch, stopping beside her. They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, looking out at the darkening land. The silence was comfortable, familiar. Alara felt a question rise within her, something she hadn't dared to ask before. It wasn't about her past, or his debt, but something simpler, more fundamental to their shared existence here. "Silas," she said, her voice soft, breaking the quiet. He turned his head slightly towards her, waiting. Are you lonely out here?" It was a vulnerable question, one that acknowledged their shared isolation. He was silent for a moment, his gaze still on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Used to be," he admitted, a rare glimpse into his inner world. He paused, then added, "Less so." Now the implication hung in the air. Less so now that she was here. It wasn't a grand declaration, not an outpouring of emotion. It was simply a quiet statement of fact, delivered in his characteristic understated way. But its impact on Alara was profound. It acknowledged her presence, her significance in his solitary life. It acknowledged their connection. A fragile warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't felt in so long it felt foreign. It wasn't happiness, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way she remembered it. It was something quieter, deeper, a sense of being seen, of belonging, however tentatively. It was a shared acknowledgement of the quiet bond that had grown between them in this remote place. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry brush nearby, but it didn't feel like a scythe anymore. It felt like the breath of the land itself. They stood there for a while longer, two figures silhouetted against the twilight, sharing the vast silence. There was no need for more words. The understanding had been reached in the quiet space between them. As the days passed, a subtle shift occurred. The silence wasn't just companionable. It sometimes held the hint of something lighter, something almost akin to playfulness. One afternoon, Alara was struggling to hoist a heavy bucket of water from the well. Silas appeared beside her and, without a word, easily lifted the bucket for her. As he did, his hand brushed hers, and this time, the touch lingered for just a moment longer. He didn't look at her, but Alara felt a blush rise on her cheeks. Later that day, a hen managed to escape the coop and led Alara on a frustrating chase around the yard. Silas, watching from the porch, let out a low chuckle. It wasn't the full, unrestrained laughter of her past. but it was a sound of genuine amusement, quiet and warm. Alara, exasperated and a little ridiculous, stopped and looked at him. And then, something unexpected happened. A small, shaky smile touched her own lips. It was the first time she had smiled in months. It felt strange, unfamiliar, a forgotten muscle twitching back to life. Silas's chuckle faded, but the smile remained on his face as he watched her. He walked over and helped her corner the errant hen, his movements gentle, his eyes still holding that quiet amusement. The incident was small, trivial, but the feeling it evoked was monumental. It was a tiny crack in the hardened shell she had built around herself. It was a reminder that there were still moments of lightness, even here, even now. Another day, they were working side by side, mending a section of fence. The work was hard, repetitive. Silas was hammering nails with practiced ease. Alara was holding the planks in place. A gust of wind blew her hair across her face, blinding her for a moment. Silas stopped hammering. Without a word, he reached out and gently brushed the hair away from her eyes. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly soft. He didn't say anything, didn't look away from the fence, but the small gesture spoke volumes. It was a moment of unexpected intimacy in the midst of their manual labor. These small moments accumulated, weaving a new pattern into the fabric of her days. The shared meals were still quiet, but now they were punctuated by occasional exchanges about the work, the weather, the signs of the land. Silas began to talk a little more, not about himself, but about the homestead, the challenges of farming in this unforgiving place, his observations of the natural world. Alara listened, absorbing his quiet wisdom. She started to feel the words stirring within her again, less like pebbles, more like seeds beginning to sprout. One evening, after dinner, Silas surprised her. He pulled out a small, worn book from the shelf. It was a collection of poems. He rarely seemed to read for pleasure, his books mostly practical guides on farming or animal husbandry. He opened it to a page and began to read aloud, his voice low and steady, the words simple but evocative, speaking of landscapes and seasons and the quiet resilience of nature. He didn't ask if she wanted him to read. He simply did it, another quiet offering. Alara listened, mesmerized. The words painted images in her mind, images that weren't shrouded in smoke and ash. They were images of beauty, of enduring life. As he read, a different kind of moisture gathered in Alara's eyes, not tears of sorrow, but something softer, a loosening of a long-held dam. When he finished, he closed the book and looked at her. He didn't seem to expect a reaction, didn't pry into her thoughts. He had simply shared something he found meaningful. And in sharing it, he had shared a part of himself. Alara looked at him, her throat tight with emotion. That was beautiful, she managed, her voice husky. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging her response. The days continued, each one adding another layer to the fragile sense of peace Alara was finding. The threat of the men who had visited hung over them, a constant undercurrent, but it didn't paralyze her anymore. It fueled a quiet determination. She worked harder, learned faster, wanting to be useful, to be a true partner in this endeavor, to contribute to their mutual safety and survival. She thought about the charred bird in her pocket and the carved one on the windowsill. One represented the past, the other the present, and perhaps the possibility of a future. She still didn't laugh, the sound too foreign, too tied to a different life. But the smile had returned, tentative at first, then more frequent. A small curve of her lips that acknowledged the quiet joy in simple things. A successful harvest from the tiny garden. The warmth of the fire on a cold night. The comfortable silence shared with Silas. One afternoon, while Alara was outside hanging laundry, she heard a faint, off-key whistling. It was Silas working on mending a wagon wheel. He wasn't a good whistler, the tune wavering and uncertain, but the sound filled the quiet air, a simple expression of being. Alara paused her work, listening. It wasn't a sad tune, or a mournful one. It was just present, a small, unassuming sound of life happening. And as she listened, watching him work, absorbed in his task, A warmth spread through her. A recognition of the quiet strength, the simple goodness of this man who had taken her in, asked for nothing, and slowly, painstakingly, helped her find her way back to herself. She looked at the laundry flapping in the wind, her own clothes, clean and mended. The cabin, sturdy and warm. The land, harsh but beautiful in its own way. This was her life now. It wasn't the life she had lost, but it was a life. And it was a life she was building with Silas, here in this remote corner of the world. The scars remained, visible and invisible, a reminder of the fire. But they were no longer the only story. There was a new story unfolding, one of quiet resilience, of unexpected connection, of finding light in the deepest darkness. She still didn't know if she would ever laugh again. That bright, carefree sound that felt irrevocably tied to a person she no longer was. But the smile was there, and the quiet warmth in her chest, and the solid presence of Silas, whistling off-key in the afternoon sun. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, not a magical cure. It was something much more real, much more hard-earned. It was hope, slow and steady, growing like the tiny seeds in the garden, pushed up from the dry earth by quiet persistence and the promise of future rain. She finished hanging the laundry, the simple task feeling like a small victory. She looked towards Silas, a silent acknowledgement passing between them across the yard. It wasn't laughter, but it was life. And for now that was enough. More than enough. It was a beginning,